You're listening to Edge Radio. This is a Media Tackle with Craig Norris, PhD. And today's show, we're going to be exploring the world of creating worlds, the world of building a world. And it's my great pleasure to have Hobart Phillips here, who's illustrator of the exciting world of Vekllei.
Very good afternoon to you, Dr. Craig Norris. Pleased to be here.
That's fine. I might ask you to get a bit more on the mic. So
This sound good?
That sounds perfect.
Loud and clear?
Yes,
Lovely.
I should creak everything around. So, one of the things that's really interesting to me that I want to explore in today's chat with you is here you are in Tasmania, and you've invested and created in this idea of a particular type of world. So when many people think of world building, I guess it's a bit difficult for them to visualize and understand what the artifacts are
it's
of
very
the
weird,
Vekllei world.
Yeah. Quite niche, quite a sort of nerdy interest, quite often. World building's quite, unusual in that it's sort of distinct from traditional storytelling, where a lot of the stuff you might expect, like a linear narrative or like a, 3-act structure or whatever, it sort of disappears. And it sort of ties into a very traditionally kind of a nerdy instinct to sort of catalog and document. In this case, like sort of an entire country or a world, or it comes in many forms. And it is weird that it's like in Tasmania at the end of the world here, but that's a great thing about the internet, I guess.
Well, I think I've been a huge fan of your work because of what I think is the new model of making media that it suggests to me. That is, when we think of wanting to tell a story, we can do that through writing a book. We could take photos. We could do a short movie. Yet the thing you've been working on, and it really is difficult to pin it down in terms of simply saying, well, it's a story, or it's a series of comics, or it's a series of illustrations, because it kind of spills out into all these new forms and mediums. Like I know you have a huge Reddit space. You have your own website where you house a lot of these illustrations and concepts. So I want to give the listener a bit of an idea of, the type of world you're making it's a kind of unified world in terms of there's would you say it's an alternate world to ours?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, tell us a bit about the history of this place.
It's great because you just jump straight into just layers upon layers of jargon. It's what the people in the scene, the world building scene, would call a retro-futuristic alt history. And what that means, that alt history term, is really you're looking backwards but sort of towards the future. That's the retro-futuristic. It's sort of a ghost past, a place that doesn't really exist. In my case, you mentioned it in the intro there, Vekllei, this country. It's sort of like it's set physically where Iceland is today. I've been to Iceland a couple of times and it left a big impression on me. And in some ways, it's got a lot of similarities to Tasmania in terms of the small, population, and it's about the same size as well. And obviously, the latitude's quite extreme. And so even though it's set in Iceland, it's not really Iceland. It's got sort of utopian dimensions to it. So it's more about escapism, about whimsy. It's about constructing a place where you feel good, and really kind of almost a vessel for your opinions about the world, your problems, and the way in which you escape them. That's sort of the utopian instinct, and I think that's how it differentiates perhaps from sort of a traditional kind of world building project where you want to tell this great story about continents and countries and empires rising and falling, this history. The utopian instinct, I think, in a lot of ways is simpler, but also in ways it's kind of purer as well. It's a very simple looking around you, identifying and looking at things and thinking about them and sort of picking the best ones and assembling them in a way that sort of means something to you.
So as you're saying this, you're really reminding me of those examples of world building that I've come across. I mean, I guess a lot of people, the one most people are familiar with might be the J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings space. So the fact that he obviously wrote The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, but then he wrote the Simulacra, the one about the language of this world.
Yeah.
So we have all these artifacts that he created where it's not simply The Hobbit, it's also this, this internal logic that he revealed. It's
immersive. Yeah, it feels like almost like a real place, because it has all the functions of a real place. He explains it. And utopianism is tied up with world building way back to William Morris, News from Nowhere. This is like the 19th century. It's a period of change. And that's what's cool about utopian fiction to me. It's quite outdated today because it's cool to be sort of pessimistic. You're probably familiar with its cooler younger brother dystopian stuff, Hunger Games and that sort of thing. But the utopian stuff is always situated historically in it reflects the time period in which it's written, and Lyman Sargent, who is sort of the godfather of utopian studies, doesn't really call utopian things. He doesn't use utopianism the way you or I might, where it's sort of a perfect world, everything is kind of majestic and there's no problems in it. He sort of classifies it as a form of social dreaming. It's a way of looking at the things going on around you and then figuring out an alternate path. And so in that sense, 1984 is a classic dystopia, but it's informed by the time period it was written in. You see reflections of the rise of totalitarianism and what George Orwell was seeing, in Europe at the time. And so in my sense, Vekllei and this kind of fictional Iceland, which incorporates all sorts of aspects, but ostensibly it's set in sort of a mid-century 1950s, 1960s thing. It's all sort of a part of a broader search for meaning that is linked inextricably to today, right now, the place in which my life and the time in which I live. And so utopianism isn't just interesting for the stories it tells, but the way you can look at those stories and then trace them back to where they were written and why they were written. There's sort of a meta aspect to it, if that makes sense.
The thing I love about your description is the idea of where the entry points are to engage with these ideas, particularly utopianism. What I was suddenly arrested by was, and this is something I want to get around to talking about, is as you were talking about that period of time, there's this kind of pre-war type environments, right?
Yeah, or almost immediately post-war, kind of like the birth of a consumer society.
Right, so that kind of...
the middle class.
Because suddenly, it's something I think we've spoken about in the past, this idea that, for me, an example of world building can be when you're watching a film and maybe you read online a fan theory about something about that world, or you'll hear a director talking about their inspiration as to why they chose certain components for a film, and it just blows your mind in terms of, wow, that's opened up a whole set of new questions. That when I saw,
there's a lot going on here in the background. Yeah.
So one of the interesting, and I know you're familiar with this, one of the interesting things I came across that was talking about, and we'll talk about this later, the Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki's work.
Yeah.
But we might kind of hint towards what we'll talk about after the next song, is this idea of world building when it was explained to me how when you look at a series of Miyazaki's films, oh my God, they found us. We're not speaking utopian enough. But yeah, when you look at some of Ghibli's film, I'm thinking specifically here, what is it, like Laputa, Porco Rosso, Kiki's Delivery Service, these films that are set in this kind of 1920s world. And I don't know if Miyazaki was interviewed, but certainly one of the stories around that world is that this is a fictional 1920s as if World War I never happened. So Europe that's portrayed there is an idealized Europe.
Yeah. Kiki's Delivery Service is really interesting because it's all bundled up in sort of kind of Japanese cultural attitude towards like old Europe, this mythic, like old rolling countryside, very like heavy on the monarchy aspect of things, pre-World War I Europe. Yeah, and it never really existed in the way it's depicted. Yet through Kiki's Delivery Service, for a moment, it does. And there's an appeal to that, not just as sort of a person from Japan seeing Kiki's Delivery Service in theatres, but sort of the way that gets transplanted worldwide into Australia. Suddenly we're resonating with these depictions of Porco Rosso and like 1930s, the Adriatic. I mean, that's the magic of cinema, isn't it?
Well, you've teased a lot there. I really do want to give our listeners some time to digest that idea of how we can locate these bigger ideas if you've seen some of Ghibli's world. But also I know you've done research on Miyazaki that I want to get around to talking. But we'll return to this, so keep listening, guys. We'll go into a song. This is Let You Know by Hannah Lawless from Tassie. But stay listening as we talk more about utopianism, world building, Hobart Phillips' work on Vekllei, and some of the inspiration that he's found in Miyazaki's work. Right, so you're listening to Edge Radio. This is Media Tackle. I'm Craig Norris, PhD. doctor trying to, I guess, why do I say the PhD? I say the PhD to lend a certain sincerity of query.
It intimidates me. I sit here as the interviewee and I'm shaking. I don't have a PhD.
Maybe subconsciously, yes. I'm using it to flex some muscle.
Deep power struggle going on in the studio.
That's right. An arm wrestle, metaphorically.
Of the mind.
That's right. If you could see, I'm visualizing one of those things like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or something, where there's these avatars that only we see above our heads that are these weird manifestations of our
one's holding a doctorate, the other one doesn't have a doctorate.
But has this amazing world that they've created. So yes, I'm talking here with Hobart Phillips, the wonderful illustrator and creator of Vekllei, which is, an amazing world which is present on various online spaces. Before I forget about telling people, where can they find this world Vekllei?
Yeah, so Vekllei started on the forum site Reddit because a lot of other traditional social media places, it doesn't have a lot of writing, a lot of pictures, and Instagram or Twitter, you have to pick one, well, the pictures really. And so I'm on Reddit still, I still post there regularly, but the best place to find me is probably at millmint.net. That's mill as in a flour mill and mint as in breath mint.
Right, so MILLMINT.
That's correct, yeah. Yeah, so I post regularly through there. I've got a lot of different little side projects, a lot of plates spinning at once.
Because, I've also visited some of the kind of social media spilling outness. So on Discord, you have this amazing community. So you've got a great big community on Reddit of people kind of interrogating, discussing, in conversation with you about the works you're posting up. Then you've got the Discord channel, which is a more kind of synchronous discussion, right? So
very
live
different
discussion.
Public face there too. Very different approach to discussion and dialogue. Very different circumstance. And then I also publish a bulletin via news, like a newsletter via email called the Atlantic Bulletin, which sort of has all the posts of that month, and then usually an essay or two from a contributor talking about utopianism or something about the project. And so that's also a very, very different method of publication or outreach from social media. So it's quite interesting that as we move further into sort of an internet dominated by big centralized kind of social media platforms, I think a lot of artists have some interest in sort of escaping to the old way, like it used to be a little bit, and to some extent forum software and an email bulletin kind of recapture, almost like a nostalgia for the early net, if that makes sense.
Well, look, as I said, it's what I really am impressed about with this world you've built is how it's really taken advantage of and lives in these new media spaces as well, right? That, again, it's not just having written a novel. It's utilizing, expressing parts of it on Discord, and then also inviting people to contribute into that space. The website you've got where the illustrations occur, but then also seeing those illustrations in Reddit, but within Reddit's own type of architecture.
Yeah, it's very multidimensional, and at the end of the day, I guess for me, the sort of utopian instinct, a lot of people might characterize it as quite sort of an intellectual decision. It's sort of very heavy and kind of about big ideas. But for me, and I think a lot of the great sort of utopian texts of the last 100 years, they tend to be very emotional. They come from a very personal, emotional place. And so for me, the utopian instinct comes from filtering in everything that's going on around me. And if I had the talent and time, I would be, making an animated series, music, a soundtrack, I'd want to be exploring as many different mediums of communication as possible, because that's the appeal of sort of a completeness, a sort of pure kind of single project that encapsulates a worldview. It encapsulates sort of a personhood. Yeah.
So while it's a very huge, and I'd refer to it as transmedia texts, nevertheless, there does feel like there's a mothership here, right? There does feel like that at its core, it seems to have maybe historically generated from those illustrations, or those illustrations kind of continue in a way which, for me at least, as a viewer, most literally illustrate what's going on in this world, right? So there's a main character in this space, right? Tell us a little bit about the main character and the world. she lives in.
Yeah, so it's a weird little set of characters, weird little world. The main character is called Zipporah, which is an Eastern European Yiddish name. In fact, it's a Eastern European version of the Moses' wife. Moses' wife, yeah, it was also called Zipporah. The characters also fill sort of a utopian role within, because utopia, it's depicted as like sort of cities and a landscape, and it's about physical place, really. But I think utopia can also encompass sort of a life experience and a valuable or a perfect or an idealized life experience. And so the characters sort of act that out. And at present, what I call a post and a picture. You know, you get a picture and then there's a post underneath and it talks about what's going on in the picture, or it uses the picture as a jumping off point to talk about some aspect of the world. The characters sort of fulfill not just a vessel for the audience, but they also represent, you know, a kind of instinct for like a good life, or not even a good life, like an aspect of life that, you know, might be missing from your own. It's all sort of part of a broader search for meaning, I guess. And so, yeah, we've got a few main characters, and they appear in most pictures as sort of almost like tour guides as you sort of progress through the world in different places. And it's further enhanced just in a physical sense by the fact that my backgrounds tend to be very painterly, sort of watercolor, inspired by animation, really. So these very saturated background plates in sort of an analog style, and then the characters are outlined in black, sort of like cells, animation cells, you know, that sit on top of a background, physically sit on top. That's how they used to do it. They take a picture of it. And so there is a physical, like an artistic style change between the background and the characters. They almost exist sort of somewhere between you and the world behind them. So, yeah.
And suddenly, I mean, I've had the real pleasure of traveling with you. So we
That's
made,
right.
I traveled with you. We spent some time in Japan. And I had the pleasure of seeing you in action, actually translating. Like we were on a train
Yeah, that's right.
In Japan at one point, and you had your iPad out. And well, what is it? Sorry, what's your equipment? What is the equipment you're using as you're traveling to create this art?
Yeah, well, as a Tasmanian patriot, I've got to use an app called Procreate, which is developed by Savage Interactive here, North Hobart. They're based, and it's an incredible app, like world-class paint quality. And if you're on Twitter or a lot of online spaces, like if you're seeing art being produced, most likely it's on an iPad with an Apple Pencil, which is a really accessible, really powerful tool as well. And so when I was in Japan and really elsewhere, everywhere I go, I like to catch a train and I pick like a long line, and then I sit on the train and I draw, and I just sort of soak in what's going on around me. That's the appeal of travel for me, is sort of immersing yourself in a space. And because, like I said before, you got that utopian instinct going all of the time, you're just sort of filtering in all the external stimuli going on around you. And so you see a train you like, you see a type of building or a style of architecture, you go, wow, that's amazing. That should be in mine. I should have that. I'm going to take that. And so, you know, it's great. The nice thing about the iPad and the pencil is that you can take it anywhere with you. It's not a big Wacom tablet. I got it set up back at home, my home base. So it's quite portable, you know. So
you have a portable on-the-go device that you capture immediately, a kind of spontaneous improvised epiphany of the world around you.
Yeah, sort of like that.
In fact, during the music break, listeners, I was really amused that you'd mentioned that the very building we're currently broadcasting out of, the social science building in Sandy Bay in Hobart, you have incorporated into your world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've got this beautiful sort of mid-century kind of modernist style of building. It's made out of sort of grids, but it sort of cascades with the landscape across multiple levels. And it's really, there's something about that, the optimism of the post-war period combined with the kind of austerity and like the kind of the poverty that a lot of countries experienced following the Second World War. That intersection of the, you know, big modernist narrative of like we're going to be Jetsons by 1980, combined with the kind of like the suffering that had just happened, but also the kind of emergence of a middle class and consumer society. There's something about that that's deeply wistful for me. Yeah, it's strange because this is me, a child born in the 90s, a child of the 90s, looking backwards towards a mid-century period that perhaps to older generations doesn't make much sense. But then again, you have people who grew up in the 50s and 60s looking back further to that, to sort of not a deindustrialized society, but one in which perhaps consumer society hadn't taken hold the way it has today, commodity saturation or whatever you want to call it. So it's interesting how I think it's not just about nostalgia for your Game Boy or whatever, came before you in your childhood, your personal experience, but a sort of cross-generational nostalgia, looking backwards, at pasts that you never experienced, but perhaps resonate with to some extent, something about them, something that you've lost just through the march of time and general progress, standards of living, all that stuff going up, something looking back and reflecting on that. And that's a lot of Vekllei for me. And that's why I'm really interested in going to countries where you can see aspects of that life sort of still carrying on to some extent, and where perhaps, Australia, well, we don't, a lot of the manufacturing's been offshore. We're all about education and sort of like a post-industrial economy these days, very globalized world, looking backwards to a very different society and a very different Australia, even an Australia with a space program.
So So while this world geographically is based in, was it Norway?
Iceland,
sorry.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, do you feel there's a local Australian or Tasmanian conversation going on in there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I love Australia and I like being here. I'm very lucky to have been born here. And last year I went up to Woomera, which is a closed government town on the way to Uluru. So it's in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, and it's surreal because it's just.
Yeah, that was a rocket testing.
Yeah, rocket testing.
What's going on there?
That's amazing. It's like Indiana Jones and some complex in Nevada with these airstrips and secret government bases, and so this is that, but in Australia, coded in an Australian suburb in the middle of nowhere.
So it's still a lockdown space?
It's opened now, but it was completely closed to outsiders traditionally, and they still test rockets out there. But there's all this really cool old tech they've got scattered around the place, and it's sort of reading more about Woomera and getting caught up in sort of post-war Australia and what an emerging Australia that was sort of more closely aligned to the US rather than the mother country over in the UK looked like. It's quite remarkable. It's hilarious. We had a state-owned industry called Government Aircraft Factories. That was the name of the company, and it produced Australian planes. That's long gone now, but it's also a very different society, a very different way of life, I guess. And Woomera kind of represents the bones of that to some extent to me. Yeah.
So, and that's what interested you about going to Woomera? This was a location that was in conversation with Vekllei, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it comes from that time period. It comes from a period of sort of general optimism and quite like a lot of trust in sort of technological advancement, which is funny. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think a lot of people are built out of contradictions, maybe. And for me, the contradiction is that I've got a lot of, I find a lot of difficulty with consumer society and the way we've commodified aspects of life. And I've got a lot of problems with, kind of consumer culture, I guess. And yet, for me, my nostalgia is looking backwards to the time where those things were perhaps their most pronounced and emerged. You think in supermarkets and advertising and a new Hoover vacuum cleaner and all this stuff. It's like that's peak. That's the peak of that kind of idea of So it's strange. I can't quite articulate why, other than the contrast between optimism and the post-war austerity speaks to me on some level. Strangely.
Yeah, there are definitely paradoxes. I mean, I immediately had a vivid image of Tetsuo Atom, right? So the Japanese Astro Boy character being spawned in this 1950s world, literally defining atomic energy as a young boy robot in a utopic kind of setting, this kind of near future world where we have robots and flying cars. But Japan, of course, having suffered the nuclear holocaust, nevertheless having Tezuka create a character from atomic energy, which was articulating a kind of utopic science narrative of this can be harnessed for the betterment of humanity. That Astro Boy fights to help humans, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
so Woomer is very Astro Boy to me.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we launched the world's 4th satellite from there, apparently. I didn't know we launched a satellite. It's inconceivable to think of that sort of today, I guess. But yeah, no, we were the testing ground for anything the UK scientists were coming
that's
up
really
with,
interesting.
Including nuclear weapons, you know.
I mean,
obviously.
and
fallout and legacy of that.
Yes, the British atomic war testing, which happened here, as well as there was a lot of coverage recently about the dish. It was in Canberra, the outskirts of Canberra, that tracked the Apollo landing, and of course was immortalized in that movie, The Dish. But that was recently recognized again as this immense nation-building apparatus, which was a utopic science dream.
Yeah, and it never really existed. Really, when I'm talking about the kind of utopia of the 50s and 60s, I'm not under any illusion that the 1950s or 60s were a utopia, not at all. But I think, in terms of like the cultural zeitgeist of a time, comparing to 2020 and where we're at the moment, and the way a lot of people I think feel and kind of struggle, especially with coronavirus, and versus something like the 20th century, especially the latter half of the post-war 20th century, looking forward towards the future and what that meant and what that looked like. And obviously it was very off base. I don't remember seeing iPhones in General Electric's Home of the Future, but there is something about that kind of misplaced optimism, despite the injustices of the time, that kind of carries across generations to some extent, I think, in different forms. Yeah, so Woomer is like an interesting example because you don't really expect that of Australia, but you can find this worldwide in various, forms.
How do you, look, I'm really curious about how do you get to Woomer? How was that? What was that
on
journey
a rocket,
like? I imagine buses.
Yeah, you got to drive out. Yeah, it's along the sort of the central highway there that goes up, and it's an incredible landscape. It really, until you visit there, you just forget how big Australia is. Size of the United States, but with nothing in it. In the middle there, across the Nullarbor, but then north of that as well, it's just flat for as far as the eye can see. And Woomera, this 50s, 60s Australian suburb, very classically Australian suburb with gum trees, just dropped by a spaceship in the middle of nowhere and living like a normal. It's got a cinema. It's got like all the conveniences.
When did you take this trip?
This was last year.
Last year, right? Yeah. So this world of travel. Yeah. Is it a tourist space? Did you get there and find
it's a pit stop for miners now,
right,
on their way out? Yeah, commuting out to the mines there in Central Australia.
So there wasn't really much interest in the cultural history that's there in terms of there are locations like Port Arthur here, which
they've got a great display of old planes, a lot of really interesting British technology, old rocket planes, and these insane, massive early guided missiles that looked hilarious, ugly as sin, but they were huge things designed for shooting down bombers or sinking aircraft carriers. It's weird seeing that as an Australian, obviously, because we don't manufacture as much as we used to. But it's weird seeing British stuff as well. We're used to it coming from either somewhere in Asia or the US. So it's weird seeing such
classic
British technology, war military technology out there. Yeah.
It's an interesting moment of history, I guess, that moment where Britain, the UK was in the shadow, but still very much a leading power in terms of technology. I mean, they'd developed jet engines and so forth during the war at a point almost equivalent, at a point superior to Germany, but then losing some of the headway towards the end of the war, but still being ahead of the US in terms of some of that science, which was coming out of the
I guess
UK.
what Woomera represents to me is a weird version of Australia that was perhaps more still tied up in Commonwealth business rather than sort of a post-war kind of American style of living and culture. Not that I think one is better than the other, but for me, it's foreign. It's an alien sort of world.
What an amazing field trip! So you go to locations like Woomera, or you've been through Japan, and then local Tasmanian locations. And a lot of that material gets integrated and digested through the Vekllei world.
Yeah, and I guess that ties into what I was saying before about it being an emotional instinct rather than sort of an intellectual decision to tell a story, and I'm going to tell it in this way, and I'm going to say these things with it. It tends to be more built upon the material realities of everything that's going on around me all the time. You know, it's a way of filtering and decompressing with everything that's going on around, the good and bad, you know. And I think utopia doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect place. It just has to be a place that, to some extent, is perfect by the imagination of whoever's producing it. A classic utopia, it doesn't necessarily have to have no war, no violence, no, you know, very sanitized, peaceful reality. I think a lot of it tends to be just escapism, and it tends to be a reflection of the pressures, the social and economic pressures of the time. Yeah,
I'd like to explore some of those ideas in a second. We might go to a quick song to allow everyone to digest those ideas, but I would like to get back to this idea of the conversation you're setting up and whether the last year of 2020 or this year of 2020, how you've integrated that into
absolutely.
this space.
Sure.
So keep listening. This is Edge Radio. This is Media Tackle. I'm Craig Norris, PhD. And
Dr. Craig Norris, PhD.
I'll just throw as many titles
Yeah.
as I can around me. Okay, you're listening to Edge Radio. This is Media Tackle, where we are talking everything in and around the world of media. And today, it's a real pleasure to have Hobart Phillips.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. The creator of Vekllei, a utopic fiction which is an enormous world. And as we were talking about in the last talk break, it's basically driven by posts and comments, you were saying. So you post an illustration up and you write a comment about it. You are thinking, as you were saying in the break, to flex some writing muscle. So this is kind of, I guess, what's happening next? So you're gearing up towards writing a short story, or?
Yeah, so I've always subscribed to this because, as I mentioned before the music break, utopianism, when most people hear utopia, it's a place, right? It's a physical place. Somewhere you can't visit, but it exists. It's a world. And I think there are more dimensions to that in terms of like a genuine expression of sort of a perfect life experience, whether that be a search for meaning by running off and enlisting in the army, or what? Yeah, there's like it's sort of encapsulates sort of a perfect human life experience as you imagine it for yourself, and that is a fundamentally kind of linear thing. If we're talking about text and we're talking about writing, a life experience has a beginning and an end, and it's got dates attached to it. It's got periods of time, whereas Vekllei as a place, the name of the country, Vekllei, it just sort of exists in it exists for as long as I need it to. It's sort of an immortal place. There's no coping with its death there or its collapse. It's just it exists by itself. And so for me, the idea behind sort of starting work on a comic was, well, I always had some interest in comics or graphic. It really is a graphic novel, but that term is just it's just a comic, you know what I mean? Graphic novel is like calling anime Japanese animation to try and make it more palatable. But the appeal of the comic is to explore what life looks like from the ground in a place like that. Because like I said, utopia doesn't necessarily have to be perfect insofar as, you know, you're looking at a society with no crime and everyone lives like kings. It has to be perfect by the metrics of the author. It represents a worldview. It represents sort of a perfect kind of place for the person creating it, linked to the time in which they write it, the time and place in which they write it. And so the idea behind a comic or a novel, but in my case a comic, is that you get to experience that through the eyes of someone, and it's more immersive that way, you know. That's what I'm looking forward to, is immersing myself in that as well. You know, I can picture that in abstract, but being able to actually sort of journey with these characters is the exciting bit for me.
Well, it'd be really interesting to see how this very large, amorphous world of Vekllei, what gets articulated in a, as you're saying, a more conventional beginning, middle, end
Yeah.
structure of a comic. And again, this will mainly inhabit an online blog space or
absolutely. And I think especially online these days, it's very common to watch through a TV show or something, or get immersed in a world and then look it up afterwards. Look up the characters in a show, and usually there's a wiki about them, and you go through the wiki and you okay, I didn't realize that because in an interview the author said this, or there was a cut episode or something. There's more information out there than just exists within the context of the show. And so for me, that's kind of my approach, because that's how I've always sort of treated television. And it's not just weird sci-fi projects either. I'm talking, Seinfeld. Go on to Wikipedia and you go read about the characters and learn something about the characters. It's sort of that instinct I'm kind of trying to capture here. So I got through the site the establishment of sort of chapters and pages talking about the economy and what it's like living in a country that doesn't use money, and language and culture and religion and all this stuff. And then once you've read that, or decided you don't want to read that, you'd rather sink your teeth into something more meaty, you've got the comic there to sort of act that out immersively,
I've always enjoyed that in my own research, those moments where popular culture creates what's called additive comprehension. So, classics like Pulp Fiction. What does the suitcase which Vincent and Marcel Wallace have? What's in that suitcase? Is it the soul of their boss? Is it so basically it's an object where there's an irresolvability to it. There's a question, there's a conundrum. It could be a MacGuffin in terms of it could be a device which is simply getting the plot along. But after you've watched the movie or the TV series, you're left with this question: what the heck did that mean? What is the black goo from Prometheus?
Yeah.
What is that substance? So you go online, and then suddenly you have this forensic fandom around you that has interrogated and debated and discussed and hypothesized what these little additive comprehension icons might be.
Yeah, and any immersive property, whether it be a TV show with a lot of episodes in it, or something as explicit as Ghost in the Shell, the manga, I believe, had footnotes in it explaining concepts of the world. That appeals to people. People like reading about the structures of a world and the way it's constructed and the way it functions and acts out, especially in genres that are about alternate visions of society.
And look, that's certainly one thing I've noticed with the world you've created, that it's really gathered this encyclopedic fandom around it. You were talking about the Reddit page, Reddit community you've set up, which is a real kind of encyclopedic generator. And some of the how many people you mentioned the number of people
on the subreddit.
Yeah, how many are we?
Something like 2,800 people. I don't know.
2,800.
By Instagram, that's not impressive metrics. But what makes Reddit special is that the activity there and the sort of dialogue you have between the creator and the people consuming the content is often quite detailed. you get sort of quite thoughtful, long form comments in response to a post you're making. It tends to be a little more personal, a little more intimate in my experience.
So, what's the experience like of dealing with the forensic or fandom that is that has aspects of encyclopedic tendency or forensic tendency?
Yeah, well, I come from sort of a world building background, which, like I said, is a very kind of nerdy tradition, and it's also quite. It comes from a sort of a desire to catalogue things and to explain things and to sort of make these into structures and constructs that you can explain and detail. And so sometimes, because my approach is quite different in that I sort of focus on what I'm interested in, and I can dispense with or rewrite or just invalidate previously existing canon because it's constantly evolving. It's part of the utopia, is that if I suddenly change my opinion about something, the world changes and becomes different.
Can you give me an example of anything that's changed?
The whole country has evolved incredibly. As I grow as a person and I change as a person, and sort of my life experience changes as well, I start incorporating new and different things. Something like how policing works and what the police look like changes radically from some Italian carabinieri, like old school monarchy royal guard type thing, who carry swords and submachine guns. It evolves into something that is far more kind of blokey and personal and Australian and kind of casual, down to earth. And so, you know, that sort of thing is changing all the time. It tends not to be big sweeps all the time, but it's constantly rewriting the old stuff. And so sometimes someone will come along and be like, well, can you explain exactly how this function of the language works? And the world building instinct is to go, oh, sure, let me just, I've got to Google that real quick, and I've got to figure out how to pronounce that in International Phonetic pronunciation. But for me, it's just been, I'm not going to tell you, because it's not currently a concern. It's not. The point of the world isn't to be comprehensive about all things. The point of it is to be sort of a comprehensive account for my worldview, which is quite selfish and inward facing, but it's also. Of course, it no longer is mine when I put it out there. Someone reading that, they might understand it comes from my heart as an author, but it's no longer mine. It takes on a life of its own, and that's the magic of art. That's the magic of creativity, is being able to share that. It's no longer me sitting here in a radio show telling you my opinions about Woomera. It becomes its own thing. It's in a different context.
So in that case, have you had to negotiate people who have said, well, let me do that for you then. Let me write the language of this world. How have you negotiated those tests? Because I know it's obviously you're very focused and it's a world that you're very personally involved in. Yeah. How do you
take on feedback? Yeah, it's hard. It feels personal because it is personal. And, you know, I mean, any artist will be able to tell you that struggle with negative feedback. Quite often, it's very useful. In the case of language, sometimes I'm just not interested in specifically like working up or making a functioning system rather than an interesting concept or interesting from a conceptual standpoint. But then other cases, I drew this picture of this really cool large mono-wing jet plane that people would use. It's not fast like a supersonic jet, like a Concorde. It's slow. It's sort of like an ocean liner or the sky almost. Moves quite slowly, but it's atomic powered. And I've vastly underestimated how big a reactor would need to be on that in order to power an aircraft of that size. You know, the total amount of megawatts generated. And someone came in. It's a very classic like world building thing. And like, actually, I'm a nuclear physicist, and this is completely you're completely off the mark here, mate. And it's like, oh, but that's actually really useful because I mean, I'm not a nuclear physicist. I wouldn't know that. And so that sort of thing, and the fact that Reddit as a platform encourages that sort of participation and also attracts that kind of person as well, who is willing to give feedback and perhaps has some expertise on some subject, that's very attractive.
So did you change the design of the atomic-powered mono engine?
It's got a bigger engine now. You know, at the end of the day, like in traditional world building, there's a timeline and you're expected to sort of fill out a realistic alternate history, because there's no way that Iceland becomes Vekllei. There's just not really a way, without majorly changing the way the Earth is, to transform it into Vekllei. So I've never been particularly concerned about that. But otherwise, I think, you know, most people realize it's like, well, the structure of the thing, the realism of or its ability, the potential for it to exist doesn't matter so much as the immersive aspect of those things do. As even if, you know, it's kind of a very strange country in which this Australian culture coexists with the uniforms and like iconography of like a Showa Japanese workplace or Maoist China or something like that, alongside, set in Iceland. It couldn't possibly exist, but as it unfolds, it feels immersive. If you put aside the fact that, this is Iceland, if you put aside, you know, the desire for realism or a consistent timeline there, it becomes immersive. And that's the most important part of communicated, most important part of expression, really.
So, as you mentioned, it's changing. Has the experience of 2020, COVID-19, the environment around you changed? Yeah. Do they have their own pandemic at the moment?
I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about, well, what would because you can't help but think about it. When you're walking down the street to Macquarie Point and they've got a COVID testing centre set up, and obviously we've had a very good shake of it in Tasmania, respectively, compared to other countries in the world have it much, worse than we do at the moment. But even just the bits that you can see here of the COVID reality in Tasmania, you see that, and of course it ends up, raising questions. It's like, well, what would that look like? And you start designing around that. It's like, well, how could you respond to that better? How could you make that? What would they look like? Who would be involved with that? And how would that affect national sentiment, spirit? How would you stop it feeling as bad as it does right now? And yeah, absolutely. Isolation is a hell of a thing for creativity and for art. Sitting, in the house most of the time.
I think, as you say, how can you turn that feeling which feels so bad into something else, right? I mean, those signs which are very matter of fact, but still trigger a reaction in terms of, COVID tests, like those big, what is it? It's not LED. They're using like almost light bulb technology with arrows. And anyway, we all know them, those kind of portable street signs. Yeah,
walking down the street, they've got big, government issued posters in the windows saying this is permanently closed, et cetera, like all this stuff about obviously like health measures in place, and it's like, it is kind of a surreal existence, of course. In fact, kind of hyper real almost. Like what's going on in the world at the moment. And so, that ties into the escapism part of thing. And of course, like your personal problems, the wonderful thing about Utopia, the stuff that's going on in your life can be transferred onto a character, but sort of reconfigured in a way that makes it graceful or makes it empowering, rather than sort of disempowering and feeling, stuck online all the time because everything's distance these days. So
look, and clearly this is in conversation with a wonderful public sphere, a community that's built up around it that enjoys the direction it's going in. And
I hope so.
I look forward to hearing where it's going. We're pretty much at time. So Hobart Phillips, I can't thank you enough for this small kind of parachuting.
Well, thank you, Dr. Craig Norris. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on the show. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you. Any final thoughts or suggestions or observations you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Oh, you should continue listening to this radio show. It's very good. Very nice man. He's got a PhD.
That's right.
Well educated. Stay safe. It's hard times. So, be good to each other.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Hobart Phillips. This has been Media Tackle for another week. Next week, we'll have Paul on, who is an artist looking at integrating Minecraft into the world. He's replicated structures around Hobart into a Minecraft world. So we'll have him on to talk about the world that he's created in Minecraft. Keep listening to Edge Radio. More exciting stuff around the corner.